chalk. By definition, chalking is the failure of a person or persons to act or behave as anticipated or expected. This can occur in a game or tournament that they are strongly favoured to win, or in an instance where they have a large lead that they squander in the late stages of the event. As the famous saying goes by Winston Churchill, history is written by the victors. However, sometimes in history, the actual failures in that event becomes more famous than the winners themselves. Sometimes the drama of the chalk in itself is so famous and written in folklore that people forget what it even was for. In today's video, I will go into some of the greatest chalks in football history. Tell me down below in comments, what have I missed out on? I'm sure that there's many more that I've missed out on, but I can only put in about 5, 6, 7 here. However, I can do a part 2 if you guys would like that. If this video does do well, so smash the like button. Thank you all for the incredible support. I think the Kai Havertz video a couple of days ago has hit 200,000 views in like a few days, which is insane. So please subscribe. Thank you for 375,000 subscribers. And of course, Mozilla Designs, let's use the code CHALK for 15% off all items. Link down below, top of the description. And let's get into it. I'm sorry, Liverpool fans. The 2013-14 Premier League title race is one of the most memorable moments in the history of English football, and the chalk by Liverpool is by far one of the most famous. So famous that if you showed them a picture of Man City lifting the title, you probably would have no idea what season that was in. If I was to ask you who did Man City play in the final game of the season to win a title, you would have no idea, because in history, no one really cares about that. That season, Liverpool, managed by Brendan Rodgers and led by Steven Gerrard, who, after almost 2 decades, have been coming agonisingly close to getting a side in Liverpool which was good enough to go for the title. At this time in Liverpool's history, it felt like it had to happen now, with Luis Suarez at the peak of his powers, with Daniel Sturridge rising out of nothing to look like an elite footballer. You've got a good blend of youth in Felipe Coutinho, Jordan Henderson to learn off the captain Steven Gerrard. And this is the situation they found themselves in. With 3 games left to play, Liverpool was on 80 points, with Manchester City 9 points behind but with 2 games in hand. With a similar goal difference, Liverpool simply had to win 2 of their last 3 games. And you may think, well, that's pretty hard to do, right? Well, Liverpool haven't lost in the last 16 games up to this point. Including that, they also won 11 games in a row after a massive win at home to Manchester City, beating Manchester United at Old Trafford 3-0. And before coming up to this game, they scored at least 2 goals in the last 11 games in a row, blowing teams out of the water, with Luis Suarez, Daniel Sturridge, Felipe Coutinho being way too much to handle, and it felt like it was only inevitable. Oh yeah, and also, how can I forget Raheem Sterling? Had one final big test. Chelsea at Anfield. On the 27th of April 2014, as Jose Mourinho's Chelsea came to Anfield, they were only 5 points behind Liverpool in the title race. This was first versus second. This was for the title. All they had to do was win. Keep in mind, Liverpool haven't won a Premier League since its inception back in 1992. They went 22 years without a Premier League. They were desperate for this, no more than Steven Gerrard, who, after beating Manchester City the previous game at home, he said in a huddle after full time, saying, "We don't let this slip, we go again." This turns out to be now infamous. Potentially top 5 most iconic moments in Premier League history. Before the end of the first half, the ball came towards Steven Gerrard near the halfway line, where on the turn, he slipped and lost possession of the ball, allowing Chelsea's Demba Ba to run through on goal and to score to make it 1-0. The memes from this is still shown and talked about to this day, almost a decade later. That slip is still talked about in many interviews with Steven Gerrard to this day, and may still be talked about for the rest of his life potentially. They simply had to go on and beat Crystal Palace at Selhurst Park. This is really the worst part of this chalk. And it went all completely in Liverpool's favour. It was dreamland. Joe Allen scores in the 18th with a Delaney on goal and Luis Suarez to make it 3-0 in the 55th minute. And coming up to the last 15 minutes of the game, Liverpool were 3-0 up at Selhurst Park when they simply had to win. Nothing can stop this happening. And then it happened. Delaney gets a goal in the 79th minute, seems to be just a consolation goal. However, Dwight Gale made it 3-2, scoring 2 goals in 2 minutes. It's now getting interesting as Liverpool tries their best to shut up shop. Brendan Rodgers can see that the game could be slipping away, and then it happened. Dwight Gale went on to make it 3-3, and Liverpool drew that game at Selhurst Park. It was at this moment that everything fell apart, and despite beating Newcastle 2-1 on the final day, they were 2 points behind Manchester City, who went on to win the Premier League title. Fortunately to Liverpool fans, that they finally got their moment to celebrate a Premier League only recently. However, for many years, this still hurt. Brazil 1950 World Cup final. In terms of football history, in terms of an impact on a nation of a single match, everything was in their favour. For me, this is one of the most tragic chalks in football history, famously known as the El Maracanazo. Played at the Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro, an attendance of 173,000, which is an absurd amount of people to think about. Brazil was in incredible form, beating Sweden 7-1 and then Spain 6-1 before this match. Brazil in their groups were 1 point ahead of Uruguay. They simply had to win or draw to win the World Cup. In that same final group, Uruguay drew to Spain 2-2 and only just beat Sweden 3-2. Brazil had scored 23 goals in the last 5 games, and after defeating Spain and Sweden in huge margins, Brazil was extremely confident of victory, and even so confident that newspapers and politicians were already declaring victory before the game even began. The journalists in the country were already saying that Brazil won the World Cup, famously in the Gazeta Esportiva in Sao Paulo and O Mundo in Rio de Janeiro. They already said that Brazil won the World Cup. 22 gold medals were made, with each player's from Brazil's team name was already imprinted on them. A victory song called Brazil Os Vencedores, called Brazil the Victors, was already composed and practiced, ready to be played after the final. The Uruguay staff laid out all the newspapers from all the Brazilian publishers and laid it out on the floor so that they can spit in the dressing room. And the game began, and it went as expected, with Brazil dominating the ball and attacking the Uruguayan back line, and they got their first goal in the 47th minute, with Friacha scoring the goal to put Brazil 1-0 ahead. However, once they went 1-0 up, Uruguay gained more control on the game as the pressure really heated up for the Brazilian team. In the 66th minute, Juan Schiaffino scored the equaliser, and only 13 minutes later, in the 79th minute, Alcides Gigia sprinted towards goal and shot towards the goalkeeper. A very low shot, which just slipped underneath the goalkeeper Barbosa, who we have mentioned in previous icebergs. Barbosa was anticipating a cross due to Gigia's position so wide on the right hand side, and by the time it went towards the near post, he dove too late and it went straight underneath him. The 173,000 official attendance fell silent. When the match ended, the stadium was filled with a disturbing and traumatic absolute silence. It has been confirmed that 2 Brazilian fans took their own lives inside the stadium, and many more were reported across the country in the following days. In Brazil, many newspapers and fans refused to believe the fact that they lost, with many journalists retiring. Moacir Barbosa, the goalkeeper, was always held as the person to blame for what happened that match. Brazil was put into a state of mourning for several years, and with Barbosa blamed for the defeat, he suffered for the rest of his life, as the match became part of Brazilian and football folklore. In 2000, 50 years later, he said in an interview, "The maximum punishment in Brazil is 30 years imprisonment, but I have been paying for something I am not even responsible for, by now, for 50 years. He was seen in such vitriol as a curse that he was never allowed to even commentate or be involved with the Brazilian national team, never even meeting the players out of fear that he may curse them again." 13 years after that final, Barbosa was presented with the wooden goalpost from the Maracanã as a present, which he took home and burned immediately. Newcastle 1995-96. On January 1996, Newcastle United were 12 points clear at the top of the table. They were in incredible form, winning a ton of their games. However, in the second half of the season, they completely collapsed, going on a run of winning 7 of their last 8 games to only winning 2 of their last 8. Losing 5 times. Being 12 points ahead pretty much means that you've got 4 to 5 opportunities to mess up. Granted on the fact that the other teams competing against you shouldn't really win every single game and they should drop some points too. Well, Manchester United was that team, and they weren't really failing, as in that last second half of the season they went on to win 13 of their last 15 games, only losing once. Newcastle spending virtually the entire season on the top of the Premier League, losing to West Ham, drawing to Manchester City, and a big loss at home to Manchester United, which really put the pressure on. Newcastle went on to then lose to Arsenal, and then famously to Liverpool in a 4-3 loss at Anfield, and it was voted as the match of the decade by Sky Sports. Despite the consequences of the result, Kevin Keegan, the Newcastle manager, said that there was still a long way to go in the title race. However, this loss really gave it a massive hit. Newcastle was falling fast, and they were falling behind Manchester United, and even got ahead of them in the Premier League with a few games to go. Although they beat QPR 3 days later, they lost to Blackburn Rovers, and Newcastle fell even more, 6 points behind Manchester United with 5 matches remaining. After Newcastle beat Leeds only 1-0, Keegan, in a televised outburst, accused Manchester United manager Alex Ferguson of trying to provoke the Leeds players. Ferguson, before the game, accused Leeds of cheating their manager in the performance at Old Trafford 2 weeks earlier, and was perceived to be a mind game against Kevin Keegan. From 12 points on top to 6 points behind is an 18-point swing in a space of only 2.5 months, which is insane to think about now. And the rant by Kevin Keegan makes it even more famous. Alex Ferguson was getting underneath Keegan's skin and was making the most out of his mind game tactics, as stated that he believes that Nottingham Forest would take it easy on Newcastle, as Nottingham Forest were due to play against Newcastle in Stuart Pearce's testimonial and might even let Newcastle win. Keegan was incensed, and when the opportunity arose after beating Leeds, he then went at Sir Alex. When you do that with footballers, like he said about Leeds, and when you do things like that about a man like Stuart Pearce, I've kept really quiet, but I'll tell you something, he went down in my estimation when he said that. You can tell him now if you're watching it, we're still fighting for this title, and he's got to go to Middlesbrough and get something, and I'll tell you, honestly, I will love it if we beat them. Love it. Things didn't work out as he hoped, as Newcastle went on to draw 1-1 against Nottingham Forest, and a few days later, Manchester United beat Middlesbrough 3-0. Keegan's "I will love it" rant is regarded as a defining moment in the history of the Premier League, as Manchester United went on to win the 1995-96 title race, and the collapse of Newcastle this season is also seen as one of the worst collapses and chokes in Premier League history, with Newcastle being only 4 points behind Newcastle by the end of the season, resulting in a 16-point swing in the last second half of the season. So there you go, lads, that is the greatest chalks in football history. Of course, there's so many more I can go into. I can maybe do a longer video when I go into a bit more in less detail, but I do a bit more. I think that could be a good video idea. Tell me your thoughts down below, and tell me what ideas, what events have I missed out on for the next one. And smash the like button, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you next time.